At the first pale light of the third morning, when the Malian Gulf lay steel-gray under a wintry mist, and the hot gates breathed their sulphurous steam, Leonidas stood with his back to the low stone wall that the Greeks had repaired in the night. The Spartans around him, men who had been taught since boyhood to make a ceremony of danger, were not praying noisily, nor boasting, nor rushing to meet the end. Some were rubbing oil into their arms. Some were calmly combing and binding their long hair as if for a festival. In the dimness beyond the pass, the Persians were assembling, bowmen, spearmen, the bright lacquer of wicker shields, the restless glitter of ornaments that a Greek would have called barbaric and a Persian would have called splendid. A messenger had come before dawn with the news that decided everything. The mountain path behind them was no longer theirs. A man named Ephialtes, seeking reward, had shown Xerxes the way. There would be no retreat that did not become a rout. Leonidas looked upon the few who remained and made the only choice that could preserve both the army and the idea for which it stood. He dismissed the many and kept the handful who would die. Thermopylae was one of those places where geography offers itself to history like a narrow doorway through which a multitude must pass in single file. The pass, then far narrower than it is now, for river and sea have since rearranged the shore, was pinched between the steep flank of Mount Kallidromos and the water's edge. Here the road from Thessaly into central Greece ran along a strip of land that could be held by men who knew how to hold a line. The springs that gave it its name, Hot Gates, were less a comfort than a sign. The earth there was active, imperfect, and fuming, like the politics of Greece itself. To understand why a king would choose to die in a corridor of stone and steam, one must widen the lens to a conflict older than Leonidas and larger than Xerxes. Persia had grown, in the century before, from a tribe among tribes into an empire whose tentacles touched the Aegean. It had absorbed Lydia and inherited the Greek cities of Ionia. It had learned the arts of administration, roads, posts, satrapies, and tribute. It had become the kind of organism that expands not always from malice, but from the logic of its own success. Greece, meanwhile, was not a nation, but a family of quarrelsome city-states, proud, jealous, and intensely alive, whose rivalries were so habitual that unity came to them only as an emergency measure. In 490 BC, the Persians had been turned back at Marathon. The victory had given the Greeks confidence without giving them safety. In Persia, the defeat was remembered not as a final verdict, but as an affront. Xerxes, inheriting from Darius both empire and purpose, prepared a campaign whose scale was intended to make resistance seem ridiculous. Herodotus, who loved grand numbers as much as grand stories, speaks of millions. Modern caution reduces the host to something still enormous by Greek standards. The precise figure matters less than the fact that to the men of Hellas the army seemed inexhaustible, like the sea. Xerxes bridged the Hellespont with boats and ropes, lashed the elements into obedience, and marched westward with the calm assurance of a power that had never had to ask permission. The Greek response was as much moral as military. Some states medized, that is, yielded or collaborated, judging it wiser to bend than to be broken. Others remembered, through pride, through fear, through a stubborn love of their own laws, that a life purchased by submission can be long and yet not quite one's own. Sparta, that harsh and disciplined city, could not easily conceive of kneeling. Athens, new to empire in its own way and proud of its democracy, could not easily endure the thought of being governed by a distant king. Yet Athens and Sparta mistrusted each other almost as much as they mistrusted Persia. The marvel is not that they hesitated, it is that, for a moment, they cooperated. The plan, conceived in councils that were equal parts strategy and compromise, was to block the Persian advance by land at Thermopylae while the Greek fleet contested the sea at Artemisium. The two fronts were linked. If the pass fell too quickly, the fleet might be outflanked. If the fleet failed, the pass could be turned by ships and landings. In such geometry of war, each arm is a hostage to the other. Leonidas was not the greatest commander of Greece. He was something more useful for the hour, a Spartan king who could embody a decision. Sparta's constitution was a masterpiece of restraint and suspicion. 2 kings, ephors, Gerousia, so that no man could easily become a tyrant. It had made of its citizens not artists or philosophers, but soldiers and guardians. It had purchased its leisure for discipline and its discipline for domination over the helots who labored beneath it. Such a state cannot be understood by sentiment alone. It was noble in its courage and grim in its social cruelty. Yet from its rigors it drew a peculiar strength. When Sparta promised, Sparta tended to perform. The Spartan force that marched north was small, and the famous 300 were only the kernel. With Leonidas came other Greeks, Tegeans, Mantineans, Corinthians, Phliasians, Mycenaeans, Thespians, Thebans, and Phocians, among others, amounting, by one ancient tally, to some 7,000 at the outset. The Spartans themselves were accompanied by helots and attendants. The numbers, like all numbers in early history, blur at the edges. But the essential fact remains. This was not a mass army, but a chosen obstruction. They were buying time. Time for the Greek cities to decide whether they were a people or merely neighbors. Xerxes arrived and looked upon the pass with an imperial irritation. He expected the Greeks, as many had done in Asia, to retreat or submit. Instead, he found a small wall of men in bronze and resolve. The story, told with relish by Herodotus, is that Xerxes waited several days, perhaps to let fear do his work, perhaps to give the Greeks time to come to their senses. During this pause, there was already a battle of psychology. The Greeks could see the immense Persian camp. The Persians could see the absurdly modest Greek position. Somewhere in that interval came the remark attributed to Dinekes, a Spartan, when told that Persian arrows would blot out the sun. "Then we shall fight in the shade." It is a sentence too perfect not to suspect polishing, and yet it captures the Spartan temperament so well that even if invented, it is true. When the fighting began, the pass justified the Greek choice. The Persian infantry surged forward, confident in numbers and in the reputation of their king. But numbers are a kind of wealth, and wealth is not always liquid. It cannot always be spent where one wishes. In a narrow defile, the advantage of mass dissolves. The Greeks fought in heavy armor with long spears, shield locked to shield, a moving wall with intelligence in its joints. The Persians, many of them lightly armored, could not bring their full strength to bear. Their dead accumulated not because they lacked courage, but because the ground did not allow them to use their multitude as a weapon. Xerxes, watching from a seat of command, is said to have leapt from his throne more than once as his men recoiled. He then sent in his elite, the immortals, the picked corps under Hydarnes, expecting that excellence would accomplish what numbers had failed to do. But excellence also has a geography. It too can be trapped. The immortals found that the Greeks were not merely holding, but adapting, sometimes drawing back to give the impression of fatigue, then wheeling and thrusting, sometimes shifting positions so that fresh men took the brunt. A line that can rotate is a machine. A crowd that merely presses is a weight. Over 2 days, the Persians learned, in the most expensive way, that Greek discipline was not a rumor. Yet Thermopylae was never only a contest of arms. It was a contest of information. A pass can be held only if one controls its alternatives. Behind the Greek position, over the slopes of Kallidromos, ran a mountain track known to locals and guarded, perhaps too lightly, perhaps too complacently, by Phocian troops. Ephialtes, a man whose name would become a Greek synonym for nightmare, guided Hydarnes and a detachment along this path by night. The Phocians, surprised at dawn, withdrew to higher ground, believing or hoping that they were the target. The Persians, leaving them, continued their descent to the rear of Leonidas. Here the drama becomes the very material of legend. A small force, informed that it is being surrounded, must choose between retreat and sacrifice. Leonidas called a council. The Greek contingents debated. Many were not Spartans, and could not be expected to carry Sparta's code as if it were a universal law. Some may have wished to remain, some may have been ordered away. Some may have left with bitterness, later to be accused of cowardice by those who did not have to make the choice. Leonidas, it is said, sent most of the allies away to preserve the army for later battles. He remained with his 300 Spartans, and with them stayed 700 Thespians under Demophilus, men from a smaller city whose freedom was no less dear because it was less famous. A contingent of Thebans also remained, whether as willing comrades or as hostages to ensure Theban loyalty. The sources differ, and history, like war, often leaves us with motives that cannot be fully audited. Before the final engagement, there came a mood that later generations would call sublime, and that the men themselves probably experienced as a quiet intensification of ordinary duty. The Spartans, who had always lived under the gaze of their laws, now lived under the gaze of death. Their king, descended in Spartan myth from Heracles, knew that Sparta's reputation was part of its strategic arsenal. If Sparta fled, Greece might collapse without a battle. If Sparta stood, Greece might yet believe in itself. It is one of the bitter ironies of history that ideals often require bodies. The last day's fighting took place not only at the wall but forward in the broader part of the pass, because the Greeks, knowing they would be enveloped, chose to kill as many as possible before being trapped. The battle became more chaotic, more intimate. Spears broke, swords were drawn, men fought with hands and teeth when weapons failed. Leonidas fell. How, no one can say with certainty, perhaps under a storm of missiles, perhaps in the crush of close combat. The Spartans fought to recover his body, and in that struggle the Persian dead were said to be thick. Xerxes, who had expected a quick submission, now faced the stubborn fact of human will. When the Persians finally pressed from both front and rear, the Greek remnant withdrew to a small hillock within the pass, Kolonos, where they could be surrounded with less room for the enemy to maneuver. There they made their last stand. Arrows, stones, and javelins finished what steel could not. The Thespians died with the Spartans. The Thebans, according to some accounts, surrendered when all was lost. It is easy for later ages to distribute praise and blame with the careless confidence of spectators. Harder to remember that in such moments a man's world narrows to breath and blood and the faces beside him. Afterward, Xerxes ordered the road opened and the invasion rolled on. Thermopylae, in strict military terms, was a defeat. The Persians marched into Boeotia. Athens was evacuated and then burned. The Acropolis suffered the indignity of foreign flames. And yet Thermopylae did what Leonidas intended. It bought time and created an example. The Greek fleet fought at Artemisium and withdrew in order. Themistocles, with the patience of a mind that sees beyond the present shock, drew the Persians into the straits of Salamis, where mass again became a liability. The next year, at Plataea, Persian land power was checked. At Mycale, Persian naval ambition was broken. In the long accounting, Thermopylae was one of the payments by which Greece purchased its chance to continue being Greece. Why has this battle, among so many blood-stained episodes of antiquity, held a peculiar authority over the imagination? Not because it was the most decisive, Salamis and Plataea mattered more in outcome, but because it distilled into a few days the perennial drama of freedom against force, of law against empire, of the small community against the vast state. It also appealed to the moral taste of the West, the idea that a handful of men can choose death rather than dishonor, and that such a choice can alter the calculations of the living. Yet a sober mind must add what legend omits. Sparta's heroism at Thermopylae was real. So was its social order, built upon the labor and fear of an enslaved class. Persia's invasion was aggressive. So was much of Greek conduct in later years, when Athens turned its allies into subjects and made of the Delian League an Athenian empire. The moral clarity of Thermopylae is a lantern held close, bright at the center, dimmer at the edges. History is seldom a simple contest between light and darkness. More often it is a struggle between different kinds of pride. Still, the stone at Thermopylae and the epigram attributed to Simonides, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws we lie," have endured because they speak, in a few austere words, for something that civilizations repeatedly need to remember: that comfort is not the only human good, that there are moments when men live by an idea as much as by bread, and that the fragile achievements of culture are sometimes guarded, not by argument, but by bodies placed like a wall in a narrow pass. In the end, Leonidas did not stop Xerxes. He stopped despair. He offered Greece a story it could tell itself while it gathered its strength. Empires count provinces and ships. Free cities count memories and oaths. Thermopylae was an oath kept to the point of death, and therefore it became, like the best of Greek things, both a fact and a form, a brief shape of human courage carved against the pressures of time, and preserved not by the victors alone, but by the gratitude of the living toward those who made victory possible.